Yeah, okay, perfect. That's good. That's really good, actually. Okay, so welcome to the Khizr Studio Podcast. My name is Mohammed Khizr, and in the Khizr Studio Podcast, we're really interested in having these discussions around human nature and the ideas and the deeper meanings behind the things that underpin our architecture and how we design our spaces. So I'm here today with Satwinder Samra, and I'm really excited to actually have this conversation with you, Satwinder, because you've been kind of a mentor to me since I set the studio up about 2 years ago. And just to give you a brief introduction, Satwinder is the director of the Collaborative Practice course at the University of Sheffield, and I think you've been doing this for about 10-20 years. You've been here for quite a while.
Yeah, I've been here for quite a few years,
Yeah.
doing a number of different roles, one of which is leading the Collaborative Practice course, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about in a minute.
Exactly, yeah, absolutely. And and you also work alongside William Matthews Associates, doing some, outside of your tutoring at Sheffield, working within practice. And you've also, on top of all that, you've also done work with the Dengineers at BBC. And what I find really interesting, and I think this is where we had an affinity right from the start, is that you come from this, you've already clocked on this idea of how can we communicate architecture to the lay person. And the Dengineers, for those who aren't aware, is a program which explores how we can design spaces with younger audiences.
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted to participate in this conversation. The thing for me that I'm really passionate about is trying to understand how we make architecture more accessible. So architecture is quite a complicated subject. It takes people quite a long time to qualify. And what I'm really interested in is how we understand not just how we make spaces and make buildings, but can we communicate the process and the final outcomes. And often what happens is there's too much information, or it's confusing, or people don't quite understand. And this is at any stage of the design process. So as a student, as a practitioner, as a recipient of architecture, whether you're a user or somebody who might work with architects. And often the biggest problems for architects, or the biggest problem that we face, is we are misunderstood. And the responsibility lies with us as a group of people to better communicate what it is we actually do, the value of that, and going beyond just talking about good design. Because people always say, oh, this is good design, just get it. But we have a responsibility to try and communicate what that could be and why it has value. And in a sense, my work here at the University of Sheffield School of Architecture, with the amazing students that I work with and colleagues, is trying to alleviate some anxiety, but also try and better understand the process of design, but also making architecture much more accessible.
That's a really good, obviously a very important thing I think that we're missing in the industry. And I mean, it comes down to this idea of how we as architects interpret the world around us. I mean, it really starts at that point before we get to the actual design. How, like in your experience and time leading collaborative practice at Sheffield, which is this amazingly groundbreaking course, allows students to actually be in practice while they're studying. How have you implemented some of these ideas within that course? These ideas of how we interpret the world, and starting at that kind of base level?
Sure. So I always say you need to be a human being as a designer. You need to live in the real world yourself and experience everyday activities. Because if you're not experiencing that as you go around, whether you wake up in the morning or go and get a cup of tea or coffee or have breakfast or meet your friends, how on earth can you design for others if you're not living in the world yourself as a human being? And often what happens is people, when they're designing buildings or students are thinking about space and ideas, they seem to think that there is a solution somewhere else, when actually your first own lived experience, in the way that we're sitting here in a space, we've created a moment, haven't we? We're creating an event, which is allowing us to have productive dialogue, hopefully. Let's see how it goes for the next few minutes. But this sense that if we can better understand how we move and how we use space ourselves and how we interact, we can bring that into our own experience, but also understanding how other people might use space or what is their lived experience. And in a sense, when you're working with a brief or you're working with a certain client, having a better understanding or listening to what people's needs might be then informs you better as a designer. But ultimately, it's about how you live in the world. How I live in the world is different to how you live in the world. I can't assume that I'm sitting here having a certain experience of this space is exactly the same as you. The only way I would understand that is by asking you, like, are you comfortable in that chair? How's the light? Do you feel relaxed? How does the acoustic feel? Do you feel like you could get up and walk around if you wanted to? What if you want to get a cup of tea? How did you arrive in the space? How might you leave? Very, very simple things. Often we forget that because we're too busy worrying about some complicated concept or some extravagant theory. And I'm not saying those things should be ignored, but start with the human, start with the individual, start with the group, start with the interaction. Where might that interaction take place?
This is absolutely fundamentally important. Now, I'm going to play slightly devil's advocate.
Please do.
Do you feel like this conversation we're having, and this is absolutely what we're trained at university level, is to understand the human experience and the human and the intimate scale, which is fundamental to design and also to communicating architecture. But do you feel like it's a bit of a privileged conversation to be having? Do you feel at a certain base level, as humans, we are the same. We have the same needs, the same desires.
Yes.
We experience comfortability in the same way, generally speaking.
Well, I'm not sure that we experience comfort in the same way. So you're wearing a jacket. It might be because you feel more comfortable, or it might be because you're feeling cold. So I might be feeling really cold at the moment, and you might not feeling cold. So we can't make assumptions. We shouldn't make assumptions that everybody has a kind of a radar of kind of comfort compliance. We should understand that we are all human beings and we have needs. I might need to eat some breakfast. I might need to sleep. But then beyond that, there are things that are nuanced or slightly different. And the role of the designer is to understand what that nuance might be. And one particular situation or approach might be relevant in one situation, but it might be different for somebody else.
Absolutely, and I think the reason I mention that is because there's so much architecture in the world today which it feels is maybe either thought of at too highly of a conceptual level,
okay,
or it doesn't actually take into account even the basic fundamental human experience of beauty or comfort,
yes,
or good material use,
yep,
or how does a threshold or a doorway stand out? How do you make those little things special? And these things, as we know, don't require huge amounts of investment, don't require a lot of money. It can be a simple case of perforating pieces of brick or something, to make a place feel different, special, unique. And we as individuals, have this desire to have our living spaces feeling individual to some extent. Why is it that so much of our architecture, in your opinion, it feels like it doesn't take that into consideration? It almost comes in at such a level where it's a little bit insulting to the everyday person. We end up with these towers, these monolithic towers, which are incredibly boring. And when are we going to get out of this kind of phase and move into something that kind of elevates us in our living spaces and our experience of architecture?
Okay, that's a brilliant point. And I'm just going to unravel that for my own understanding. One area is around the understanding of the user or a person who might use space. The other is something around high conceptual ideas. High conceptual ideas are important. It's good to have an idea. If you don't have an idea, it's not that easy to move forward. So if you were designing a tower or a complicated project, you might have an idea about a symbol in the city, or the way that it's very monolithic, or you want it to make a gesture. So that is an idea. It's a conceptual idea which allows me to communicate to you why this building is important in this particular place. So that's kind of okay. I don't have a problem with that. But in addition to that, sometimes often designers forget the really simple things which are quite subtle, and if they're done well, no one's going to talk about them because they're just going to naturally use the space. So as you suggest, how you arrive at a building, the moment when you leave something that might be more to do with the city and more to do with the domestic or a more private space or something that's more communal. Where do you put a chair? Where is a window? Do you have a view? Where do you put your coat? How do you move around a space? So I often say that you should spend time and money on space, as in make that as generous as possible, but not over generous, and spend time thinking about how you arrive, how you move through, what is the view, where do you have a cup of tea, where do you have a conversation. Now that could be used in any situation, in a domestic situation in a house, it could be in a coffee shop, it might be in a public building like a library or even a hospital. Those are the things that give us a kind of grounding or allow us to use buildings in a certain way. Now, whether the building looks like, I don't know, a penguin or a seesaw, or it has a certain kind of form or a certain gesture, so be it. It's not my kind of thing, but we need to ensure that we get those simple things right, and often we don't get those things right. And it's no surprise that the general public feels disconnected or disenfranchised with the built environment that they're expected to use, expected to use, but also expected to feel nourished with that environment around them.
That's fantastic, and I think to sort of move on to something else that I'm really interested to talk to you about. We both tutor at Sheffield. You obviously in a much more formal role than I do. In my opinion, and also having studied here and been an architecture student, a lot of the time I've found that the good tutors are the ones that instill a certain level of confidence within a student. It's not necessarily that the best tutors are the ones that are the best architects, but actually they're the ones that can look at your work and push you to the next level and give you confidence to push yourself to the next level and really push an idea right all the way through. And the bad experiences I've had with tutors are tutors who do the opposite.
Hopefully not with me.
Not with you.
I don't think I taught you though, did I? Not directly.
I think we had one crit maybe.
Okay.
And you were very good. I mean,
Thank you.
You're obviously one of the you're obviously one of the better tutors. But but I found if I ever have a bad experience with a tutor, it's because, and this has rarely happened, but when it has, it's been because there's been too many ideas floating around, and as a student you feel like this is my tutor, they know better, I should do what they're saying. And I see a lot of students when I tutor them, and I say, well, why have you done this? And they say, oh, this tutor told me I have to. It comes back to that idea of a lack of confidence. And I found that for me, when I did my master's, a big transition I saw in myself was that I was much more confident coming out of those 2 years of practice. And I was much more confident in looking at what a tutor said and knowing which bits I needed to take and which bits I needed to leave. So anyway, that's a long way of sort of saying this idea of design doubt. Do you experience this in your tutoring? And if you do, how do you instill confidence in students? Because I know this is something you're exceptionally good at, and I remember you being great at this. And you're very good at articulating confidence. So how do you go about doing that? And how do you think, do you see that as an issue with students in architecture school?
I don't think it's an issue with the student. I think the topic is around design doubt or dealing with doubt. As a designer, we are often looking at or trying to understand the possibilities of what you might do in a certain situation. Being unsure is okay. Not knowing what to do next is okay. So dealing with doubt is totally fine. It's a natural part of the design process. However, in schools of architecture, often doubt isn't discussed. So when the student gets stuck, they believe they've got stuck because they're not very good. But getting stuck is okay. And if we talked more about getting stuck and it's okay not to know, I think students would feel much more relaxed. The way that you navigate the doubt is by finding something you're interested in, or finding something that interests you about a particular place or something from the brief, but then you must draw it, and then you must share it, and then you must reflect on what the conversation comes about from that, and then you do it again, and then you just keep doing it. So myself as a designer, that's what I do. The work that I do with my friend William Matthews and many other people, we're constantly looking at opportunities, and we're dealing with the doubt, and it's just normal. And often what happens in schools of architecture is students get stuck. No one talks about why they're stuck. So the student believes they're not very good, and the tutor sometimes just says you need to do more work, or they say that's not good enough, or they say why have you done this. So if you are questioned about a design process, it's easy to, if you've got a project and you say I've got this idea and I say why have you done that, then you're going to start to believe that it's not very good because I'm asking you lots of questions. When perhaps what I should do as a tutor is to try and understand what the potential is, and to say it's okay not to be sure about that bit, maybe try this. But the other thing that happens is often there isn't much gratitude in schools of architecture.
What do you mean by that?
So what happens is you turn up with your project and I just start asking you lots of questions. And it happens in crits. And then you start to think, well, it's not very good because they're just asking me lots of questions. Whereas if you shared what you'd done and I said, well, I really like this bit, that bit's working well, perhaps moving forward, you could try that. Or I might ask, which bit are you unsure about? Then we talk about doubt. But I think sometimes students might think that there's a secret solution, there is an answer to any given situation, and why don't you just tell me that, Satwinder, and then I can just go on and do it. So absolutely needs to be more conversations about dealing with doubt, understanding it's a natural part of the design process, and it's okay to be unsure.
I absolutely agree with that, and you're absolutely right about the fact that if you're immediately asked a bunch of questions, you start to think, well, it can't be that great then.
Why have you asked me that question, Mo? Mo, what were you thinking about when you asked me that question? Why are we doing this podcast, Mo? Why are we here? So if I start asking those kinds of questions, what will happen is your body language will change and your mind starts to think about...
And you sort of get on the defensive a little bit.
You will then start to become defensive. And then rather than us having a productive conversation about something, we end up kind of... there is an opportunity for dialogue. And that's what often happens in crits. And it's no surprise that students don't like crits. Because ultimately the crit is a problematic... it's problematic.
This is really interesting actually. I completely hear what you're saying. Again, to play devil's advocate a little
Please
bit.
do.
We think one thing that I saw even at master's level, which at undergrad I think it's kind of okay, but at master's level, a lot of some students almost want the tutor to lead them, and I remember seeing this attitude and thinking it doesn't show a level of confidence in your own ability. It doesn't show a level of confidence in your ideas. If you're not able to push things, if you need the tutor to kind of hold your hand. Now, I get what you're saying.
But I think it's okay for the tutor to hold the hand because this is a learning environment. The student is on a learning journey. Why is there an expectation that the student should know and then they just get on with it?
Agreed. But to a certain level, shouldn't we also be teaching students to be confident? That when they go out into practice, and there's no one there, no one's job is to hold their hand, and they're feeling this same situation of pressure and don't know what to do. Shouldn't we be teaching them, look, when you get to that point, which is very natural, to persevere and push through and look at different ways of doing things and
sure.
But have that level of confidence.
But confidence comes through practice and also having some skill set by having practiced a number of skills. If you don't have a toolkit or you don't have some skills, how on earth are you going to be confident in a learning environment when you're age 19 and you've only been doing this for 6 months?
I tell you what was a turning point for me was realising how subjective architecture is. I think when I was an undergrad, I remember thinking there's a right and a wrong. When I got to masters, I think the big turning point for me was realising, no, there is no right and wrong. I mean, the laws of physics are the right and wrong. You know,
sure.
What can you actually physically build? How deep can your cantilever be, physically speaking? That's right and wrong. But in terms of taste, a lot of architecture is based on taste, which is incredibly subjective.
Yeah, on one level, I absolutely agree with you about the subjectivity. But for me, what's important is how interested are you in what you have done? Is it appropriate and relevant to that particular situation? And how are you improving that given situation through architectural ideas? And then for me, what it looks like, I'm not that bothered. As long as it's not overscaled, or perhaps it's not, and it's using the right materials, and it's convivial, and it's resourceful, and it's not having a huge impact on the planet.
So in your opinion, it is about the problem that's solved within that?
It's about it's about the opportunity of the given situation. So if you have a location, you have a site, there's some opportunity and you want to design a certain kind of building, then you should read the place, then you should try and make some connections about what could be improved, and then you show how architecture has done that. Whether it's green, yellow or brown, doesn't really matter. It might matter to the person who lives next door that they don't want a yellow building next door to them. That's a different conversation.
Yeah. Fantastic. No, I fully agree. I think you're absolutely correct. And I found that way of thinking is what architecture school kind of trains quite well. That way of thinking of what is the problem we're trying to solve. And when you come down to it at kind of base level, that's what design is. It's about solving problems.
Finding opportunities, trying to make things a little bit better. Sometimes you don't even need a problem. You just need a situation or some people that might have a need. And then how does design make that a little bit better?
So another thing that I wanted to talk about, which leads on from this conversation, is the idea of making mistakes.
Yes.
Freaks people out. What is your opinion on sort of the idea of trying out new things, that fear of failure?
Okay.
Not necessarily failing the course, but I mean in terms of when you're in the grit of design.
So when you're designing, you are dealing with uncertainty and doubt. So we've acknowledged that it's okay to feel like that. The only way you work out if something works is to draw it and share it. It doesn't exist in your head. Often I'll hear students saying, I've got it all worked out, it's in my head. And I will say it's not worked out because it's in your head and you haven't shared it. The act of sharing not only helps you as the designer to see what the potential is, but it helps someone else to see and offer an opinion and have insight. So there has to be dialogue. Making mistakes on one level is kind of okay because it's a learning environment. You learn by doing, you learn by trying things out. But the idea of failure for students is very current because no one wants to fail, everyone wants to pass and do good work. But the way you do good work is by turning up, trying things out, sharing the work with colleagues, getting feedback and then moving to the next stage, which is no different to working in practice. But with more experience, you will have a toolkit or a way of working that allows you to keep moving forward.
How do you define failure?
How do I define failure? Well, it didn't quite work out how you expected it. So it might be a failure in your eyes, but someone else might think, well, that's kind of okay. So it's okay. There's going to be bumps on your journey. And it's okay to have bumps. If you don't have any bumps, there's no point in being here because if you don't feel like the need to learn, then there's no point in going on a learning journey. So I always say students and myself, we're all on a learning journey. And the way that you learn and improve is by trying things out and then reflecting and then you do it again.
I completely agree. And I think my view on this is a little bit radical. I actually think it's incredibly important to make mistakes because the bit that we miss out a lot of the time is that it's through those mistakes that you learn lessons.
Absolutely.
And I can say from my experience, I was you know, it took me a long time as an undergrad student to understand architecture. You know, I remember seeing other people in my year thinking, God, they're brilliant. Like, these are amazing designers. Why can't I understand this? Why can't I get it? You know, I want to do good
better.
design. I want to be better. And looking back on it, that 3 years, it took. It wasn't a case of I made a mistake and then next week I was brilliant. It took that 3 years of making mistakes. And when I got to masters 5 years later, I was like, oh, that's how I do this. You know, that now I get it. I've made these mistakes already. So, and I believe that to a large part, the school system, before we get to university, there's always a right and a wrong, and there's always a fail and a pass. And we're trained over, you know, a decade to think in this way. So when we get to architecture school, to a course which is incredibly subjective and based on taste.
Well, some of it is subjective and based on taste, but ultimately it's about, have you done any work? Have you shared it? And how does it, what's it look and feel like at the end? Well,
assuming a student does the work, assuming they do the work, a lot of the time we're still stuck in this binary mindset of it. And that's where I think a lot of the pressure comes from, is because I've seen
people are looking for the answer.
That's it. And I've seen crits with students who are absolutely incredible designers, like years ahead of where they are, like absolutely incredible. And you know, it's a testament to the tutorage at this university. Like some of the students come out with amazing work, and I've sat in their crits and I've seen them break down. And I remember thinking, what is it? They've achieved a level of design, a level of ability that many people wish they had. Many people sitting here watching wish they were this capable. But when it comes to that idea of failure, it's still so strong in them. You know, that even though they've done such amazing work, they still have this tension of I'm gonna fail, or I've done something wrong. And I think my belief is it comes from that decade at school where we're constantly told, you know, push towards the right answer.
Absolutely, there's a syllabus. It's given to students. They practice knowing the syllabus, and then they play it back, and there is no nuance. So that's a kind of educational problem, and it's no surprise that students arrive at universities wanting to carry on being the best, and that's not a bad thing. But you join that up with the idea of a design process which is dealing with something that's more contingent or unknown,
where you may make mistakes,
and it's okay. But so it's no surprise that it causes students anxiety.
So I mean, based on that, so I'm interested. What's your view on this? Do we share a similar view on this, or in your view, is architecture school a bit more of a? Do you believe it's a bit more of a linear thing? You know, in terms of how you conduct a module or a design process?
I know from my experience, if you do certain things as a designer, it will help you to become a better designer. So part of that is practicing speaking about what you do, practicing making models, making drawings, sharing them with other people, and ensuring that you keep practicing doing that. It's not going to happen overnight, but with time you become more relaxed. And also you've got to be inquisitive to the world around you, so to understand how other people might approach that problem or that situation. So I know that a certain architect might have a certain approach, which is about arrival, movement, landscape, daylight, sustainability. Another architect, their approach might be about form and creating a spectacle and the visualization of that idea, which becomes more important than the other. So I think what's important for students is to understand what is their approach, and then learn from the approach of others, and then bring that into their own work.
And I suppose you mentioned, you were talking about communicating and being able to communicate your ideas. It kind of brings us back full circle in a way to the work that you and I are really interested in right now. Obviously with Khizr Studio, with this podcast series, Khizr Studio that I founded two years ago, the idea behind the studio is to communicate architectural stories. And these projects that we labour over and we design, and this design process we've been discussing, which is incredibly stressful, and leads to, in many cases, exceptional design. The general public isn't aware of this, and they're not aware of that process. And I think there is a hunger to understand how that works. At the minute, there seems to be something missing, that interface between public and practice. So that's a problem that Khizr Studio is trying to solve, and I think through some of these conversations we're trying to open up some of these philosophies and ideas to people who are non-technical. And then of course with your work with Dengineers and some of our more recent collaborations. Now I'm not sure how much we're allowed to talk about, some of the more recent stuff we're doing, because it's yet to be released. But what do you think about this idea of how we communicate to the public some of the work you're doing more recently?
So I think there is a disconnect, which is to do with explaining what it is we do as designers, number one, but following on from that, being slightly more direct in explaining something about buildings and architecture. Architects are trained to deal with very complicated situations, and they're always dealing with the complexity of many things. And they've lived and breathed something while they're designing it. So whether they're a student or a practitioner. So then when they come to talk about it, what they often do is they say too much, and they speak for too long. And sometimes the words they use are complex and hyper-professional. So what's important for me, and this I've learnt this through working in television with the Dengineers, is how do you tell simple, compelling stories that allow people to understand what it is that you do, or what a space is like, or a building is like. And what I often say is what is it, where is it, and how does it make you feel? And what I've learned from my work in television is being more precise and being more engaging. Using your voice, using your body, doing whatever you need to do helps people to come on board. Because once people are on board, they're more likely to listen. Once they listen, they're more likely to have empathy, and then they're more likely to tell someone else the story that you gave to them, whatever that story might be. So in terms of how that's impacted my teaching, we do a lot of work around speaking about work in a concise way, working to time, working with your audience, making sure that what you say relates to what's on the screen or on the wall behind you. Often when people start talking, they just start rambling, and before you know it, they've spoken for 3 minutes.
And just to clarify, we're talking about the kind of crit or review.
A crit, review, architect presenting to a client.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I've seen this in a lot of my work. I know when someone stands up to talk about their work, in the first 10 seconds, I know if they're going to run over time. Because I can sense from their body language, I can sense from the way that they're about to start speaking.
So how important in your mind is that idea of how we communicate ideas?
110%, absolutely super important. And this is where the profession is missing a trick, because it's still sometimes unable to connect with their audience. And if you don't connect with your audience, then people become disconnected or disenfranchised. And it's not the role of the professional bodies to do this, it's not the roles of the schools of architecture to do this, it's the roles of individuals to lead by example.
Well, just to build on that point,
sure.
From my experience with practice, working through Khizr Studio, I've seen that a lot of the time practices think their end user is the commissioner. So whether that's a council, they'll think that that is the body they have to please. They sometimes forget the end user is the actual person who's going to be living in the building. So whether it's sticking to a prescribed floor area, determined floor area that they've been given, whatever the design constraint might be, sometimes the designers forget that they're designing for the end user, which is just the everyday person that doesn't understand some of the complex conversations
sure.
we have in design meetings. They don't realize that actually the end user, all they want, and it comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, sometimes what they want is a space to live, a space to carry out their lives, have experiences, have comfort. It's interesting how sometimes we forget who we're designing for, and we get carried away in this bubble of architecture, the world of architecture, and complicated language, and trying to introduce a shadow gap somewhere, when in reality, how is this going to impact someone's life? Is it going to add to their life? Is it that important? That level of prioritization.
Yeah, and I've total empathy for architects, because there's a lot of pressure to provide a certain kind of design or a layout, and often there isn't the investment from society generally to give time to allow that to happen properly. So I think it's easy to blame the architects that they didn't do this and they didn't do that. But if there is a disconnect between the designer and who's paying for and who might use, then it's no surprise that things don't work out or they go wrong. But ultimately, as a profession, we could do a lot better if we could better communicate what it is we do and why it has value. So often people talk about good design, but no one knows what that means. I kind of know what it means, I should do, but it's a very generic term, which is kind of used as a label, as a catch-all. But ultimately, people know if the space is working for them. They shouldn't need a guidebook or an architect to tell them why it's a great building.
Yeah.
And going back to your earlier point about revealing these ideas, the work that we've been doing, which is, an idea for a TV show, is ultimately trying to reveal what makes really good buildings, but more importantly, speak about the stories of the people that use the buildings. That's why it's called Architecture Uncovered. It says what it is on the tin. But I think in terms of communication, there is a lot to be said for empowering students to be able to communicate clearly within time with the resources that they have, because that means that they're more relaxed, and the audience, whoever that is more likely to come on board, and then they're more likely to have a productive dialogue about what could happen with this project. So often the reason that reviews or crits go wrong, or a project in practice doesn't quite go how someone expected it to, is because the person who was presenting didn't clearly get across what they were doing, which then didn't allow the audience to fully understand what was happening or what their role could be as an active participant. It's that simple, but to do it requires quite a lot of practice and an acknowledgement that these things need to change.
Absolutely, and it's very difficult as an architect and as a student, because you have to show an entire project at all these levels of scale, at an urban scale, at a domestic scale. You have to show technical aptitude, you have to show you understand the human experience, your artistic ability to express atmosphere, all of these things. And then and very often it's like the night before you're still wrapping stuff up, and then you're presenting and you've got to have a coherent story. And I remember thinking that, well, the presentation bit's a bit you do at the end, figuring out the story.
But presentation isn't a separate aspect to being a designer.
Exactly.
So ensuring you know where the front door goes is as important as what you will say in the first 30 seconds of when you present your project.
Well, absolutely, and the interesting thing is the presentations that I saw that went really well didn't necessarily have everything worked out in the actual project, but they were able to, the presenter was able to steer the conversation in the way they wanted.
They were sharing a project that's in process. All projects are always in process. The project isn't finished until it's built. And even when it's built, it's still not finished, is it? Because it needs to be occupied and maintained and have a life. So I believe it's important to just share what you have at that moment in time, but do it in a manner that allows you to gain feedback and allows your audience to participate, rather than this idea that you're going to court to justify the ideas that you've had and you have to defend your project. So the words that are often used in architectural education, like the crit, the jury, having an argument, defending your scheme, critique, it's like you just design some architecture and you want to share it with people and you want to make it better. So the language needs to change as well, and the behaviour of the people in the spaces need to change as well. So it's no surprise that students leave architecture school carrying this burden, thinking they're not very good and being quite defensive and not being able to communicate with the broader public. And some of that is to do with what happens in architecture schools.
Why do you believe the language needs to change?
Because the language is not productive or inclusive. The language is creating lots of barriers.
And do you think in changing language where it will lead us to better architecture?
Absolutely.
Why do you think that?
Well, because if a designer is more able to communicate with whoever they're working with, they're more likely to be more receptive to the feedback that they might get. And the user, client, commissioner, whoever, is more likely to better understand why this has value.
Actually, I do agree with you, because I think I would have benefited, I think we all would have benefited from this kind of thing. But in doing that, are we catering more to our egos as designers, that, you know, we don't want to hurt our egos? And are we then focusing less on the architecture?
The two go together.
So the ego and the designer's ego and the architecture they're designing.
Well, the ego is something that you bring to any situation, and sometimes it needs to be tempered. But if you're designing for yourself, paying for it for yourself, by yourself, and you're going to live in it yourself, then let your ego go, like, let it fly.
And are you referring to architecture school by that?
It can be both, all situations.
Well, let's use the scenario or the example of, like, you're working in a practice.
Yeah.
And you're designing for other people.
Yes.
Now,
I would always say with.
Designing with other people.
Yeah. So if you're my client, we're working together, I'm going to design for you because you're paying. But ultimately, it should be a collaboration, because I need to empathize and understand what you really want to get out of this situation.
Absolutely. So let's say in that dynamic.
Yes.
And obviously this is very, very, like, individual, but some people will become more offended and more defensive. Like you said at the beginning, even though the design is being critiqued, they'll take it personally.
The designer?
The designer. But some designers are incredibly efficient at they're very utilitarian in a sense. They'll kind of separate, they won't take anything personally. They'll extract their personal views from the situation. They'll be purely professional and allow their architecture to be critiqued and refined, and understand that this is a process that's making it better. Now, my point is that, going back to what you were saying about the changing of language, do you think that softening language will essentially definitely lead to better architecture? Or
100%. 100%. Because if you have dialogue and people work together, the outcome's always better, because they feel like they were part of something. That's what I believe. Other people might disagree with that.
I completely agree that it's a collaborative process. But the situations, like I mentioned earlier, where, you know, a student will have an amazing piece of architecture to present, but they'll feel so pressured that, you know, what is everyone going to say? What does everyone think? Will they not like it?
Okay.
That kind of ego, you know, I almost feel like I would have, as a student, loved to.
This sounds like it's a therapy session for you, Mo.
Probably is. It probably is. I'm using a lot of my own experiences in this, I've realised. So this might purely just be me. But
how could we have made it better for Mo?
No. It was. I think a lot of these things you have to learn by experience. So sure. I don't think you know, there's anything that could have been done differently in my experience. But looking at how we're going forward in academia, and you and me tutor now, do we think that necessarily cushioning everything we say is the best approach? Or should we tell students, look, when you're in a crit, when you're in a review, a design review, everything isn't, you know, I don't know, it's hard to, I don't know if you can actually even do this, but, you know, don't take it personally in a way. Don't be offended personally by this language. Don't take it as a kind of hit your ego.
So my approach to that would be to choreograph the situation before you even turn up. So that if you share well and you bring people with you, they're more likely to be supportive of what you're doing. So you're less likely to get asked difficult questions or to be told that it's not very good, because it's about building a relationship with your audience.
That's really interesting. So what you're saying is that actually there's another dimension to this. It's not just purely
Not just standing
the
up and going, here's what,
yeah.
It's about
how we
reading that
bring
situation.
people along.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that should be part of the training of architects, about how they share well and how they listen and how they bring people with them. So it's not about convincing people, it's just about saying the project has this life and we're going to work on that together.
What do you think of those architects who turn up to the external reviews and they'll think they're, you know, Mr. Know-it-all, and they'll try and rip the student apart, you know, go straight in hardcore and say things like, you know, you shouldn't be doing architecture?
Well, I think those kind of people,
which do exist.
They do exist, and I don't think that they exist here very much.
Or even in industry, let's say. If you're pitching
you're going to meet difficult characters. So I don't think there's a place for that, especially in schools of architecture. It's easy for someone to just turn up and say this is not very good, or to say I could do better, or this isn't going to work. This is a learning environment.
Well, the point is that this is a learning environment, but you know, the majority of our time is going to be in industry, 60 years or whatever it is.
Yeah, but this idea that architecture school has to be really tough and aggressive and people need to ask difficult questions, because when you get in the real world, and I am now in the real world, if I pinch myself it hurts. Everything we do is real, okay? Often in practice, people are actually quite empathetic and they do listen and they're convivial and professional. So that should happen right across the board. So this idea that it has to be tough in architecture school because it's tough in the real world, I think is a bit of a cop-out. And what's happening is people are adopting that behaviour in reviews because they had that happen to them and they believe that's the best way to become a really good designer.
Yeah, no, agreed. And it's an absolute turn-off, you know, when you come across characters like that.
It's not good. And they shouldn't be allowed anywhere near schools of architecture.
Yeah. It's almost as if they've forgotten their humanity and they don't see the person in front of them as a human.
Yes.
They just see this design and they think, you know, they know better. They have to exercise their authority in some way.
Yeah.
Whereas they don't realize that this is a person and you need to address them in a certain way that they'll listen. Because there's a certain level where the person's going to switch off because they're going to think, well, this guy's... Well,
there is going to be no dialogue, because the dialogue stopped from the moment someone started being aggressive. Then it becomes a defensive, legal situation. And it's not a legal situation. Someone's designed a building and they want to talk about it and they want to know how to make it better.
Yeah, egos. It's egos, man. It's egos. Agreed. So I wanted to talk to you about diversity.
Yeah. And
the reason that's interesting is because I come from a minority background.
Yeah.
You come from a minority background.
Yes.
And I remember when I started studying at Sheffield in 2014, in terms of male-female split, I think it was I might be wrong on this, but I remember someone telling me it was the first year where we had more women in the year than men. So demographics are changing in our industry and it's really fantastic to see. Coming from a minority background, how has the experience of going through the REBA process, becoming an architect, being a tutor, working in practice, how's that all been for you?
The process has been brilliant for me because I had some opportunities and I was able to take them. I studied here at the University of Sheffield School of Architecture, had a great experience, and then I worked for Urban Splash and Procter & Matthews. Again, really wonderful experience, and then more recently I've been working with William Matthews and the BBC. So a really, really sort of productive and enjoyable experience. However, being an Asian architect, being a person of colour, there are moments when I have felt excluded. And I'll give you some examples. This is turning up in a professional capacity to deliver a talk or be part of a panel where I've been mistaken for the taxi driver or the waiter. I'm not sure why that is. I'm sure you can work it out. Now, the other thing that's happened to me is I'm a brown architect and I've got other friends who are brown architects, and we get mistaken for each other. And again, I don't know why that is. To the point where one person was told that they were me, and when the person said, no, that's someone else, they were told that they were the person that this person believed that they were. So for me, it's really important that I keep turning up and you keep turning up, and people who might feel that they are different or they're not part of the homogeneous kind of makeup of the profession, that we have a role to play, we have a voice, and we have to practice having an opinion. And the way you do that is by keeping on turning up and saying what you believe in, and being an ambassador, being a role model, not just for yourself, but for the people around you. So I'm an RIBA role model, which is about inclusivity and diversity. And I think ultimately it's about trying to do good work and being a good colleague and leading by example. And so that's one side. I think the other side that's interesting is sometimes we might speak differently, or we might have a different way of seeing the world, like we talked about earlier. So as designers, it's super important that you not just acknowledge the views of others, but you acknowledge your own opinion, and you celebrate where you come from yourself and what you bring to the table, because that's really important. Because often, if you are from a minority, you can end up just keeping that slightly in the background, or one ends up apologising without apologising. And so yeah.
You think that it is something to be celebrated?
100%, absolutely. So I'm very proud of my background. I went to a comprehensive school. I had the lowest grades in my year. I very nearly didn't get into this school of architecture. So there's been moments where I think, do I belong here? Should I be here? Perhaps somebody else should. And now I'm like, I absolutely belong here, 100%. And I think there's a sense of self-belief, and also that it doesn't matter what your background is, it's still important, and you should be proud of it, not apologetic.
I think that's a wonderful place to end, and I just want to say it's a real honour for me to have had this chance to speak with you, Satwinder, and it's really amazing to see someone reach your level, someone from a minority background, so that's really inspiring. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I think that the work you're doing with Khizr Studio is amazing. I'm grateful to you for helping me in terms of my recent journey where we're developing this idea for a TV show. I think the future is bright for you, and I think the future is bright for people like you and anybody else that's listening in. If you're not sure, just have a go, try it out, tell people what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sat. Thank you very much.